Well, thank you for the invitation. Ambassador Gibeb, Director Professor Gross, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. The subtitle of my lecture today is Colonial Objects Imposed, Appropriated and Exchanged. What is a colonial object? There is no consensual vision in the available literature. In my view, there are three possible and complementary definitions. An object carried by the Europeans elsewhere as a symbol or tool of dominion. Secondly, an object invested with meaning by European explorers in the act of discovery or conquest and brought back to Europe. Finally, an object produced in the colonies. I will focus on the first two cases. My argument is that collecting objects from other continents was part of a project of European expansion. Unknown minerals, plants, and animals, as well as artifacts and objectified human beings, radically changed classical knowledge and contributed to the European claims of universalism. The diffusion of European objects, such as the cross pillar stones, which brought us here, were the symbolic expression of that expansionist project, since they were used to assert capacity to explore, precedence in discovery, and the intention of future occupation. And I underline intention of future occupation. Other objects, such as ships, guns, garments, pillars of punishment, but also forts, stone houses, and churches, were related to the implementation of the expansionist project, which implied changes of local habits, beliefs, and ways of living. The analysis of these two sets of objects will lead us to reflect on the functions of cabinets of curiosities and later museums, which expressed different and juxtaposed periods of European expansionism, colonialism, nationalism, and imperialism. The properties of objects will also be at stake in this analysis, since they often resist classification and can be reinterpreted in other contexts. They had their own qualities, which justified interest, attraction, and possession. This long-term approach will include the independence of the colonies and the post-colonial period in which we live, since it imposed radical changes in the logic of museums and constitution of collections. The axial civilizations always had their own voice, while local communities around the world revealed agency and capacity for negotiation, but it was after the Second World War that peoples of the world found new institutional possibilities in the international arena to develop a dialogue that brought with it a re-evaluation of objects now better linked to their original purpose. This dialogue has a significant impact on the way collections are formed and displayed. The research in museums or around collections is now based on cooperation and involvement of source communities, disrupting the long-term European monopoly of knowledge and classification. My argument is thus tempered by this long-term trajectory, which saw the collection of colonial objects as justification for European expansion and supremacy being transformed in sources of knowledge and empowerment for local communities and civilizations in different parts of the world. So I had a PowerPoint. Stone pillars with crosses at the top, carved coat of arms of the King of Portugal, and inscriptions in Latin and Portuguese with the name of the king, the expedition's date of departure and the captain's name were erected in different parts of the coast of Africa and the coast of Asia from the 1480s to the 1520s, during the reigns of John II and Manuel I. This practice is attested by contemporary chronicles and accounts, particularly by Rui de Pina, which have been incorporated by the main 16th century chronicles of the Portuguese expansion, particularly by João de Barros and Fernão Lopes Castaneda. The way these chroniclers designated the pillars is significant in itself. Padrões, meaning monuments or landmarks, columns carved for the memory of some event, such as the arrival at a distant land, a memorial which commemorated the voyage sponsored by the sovereign. I follow here the two main Portuguese dictionaries of the 18th century by Rafael Blutot and António Moraes Silva at the beginning and end of the century. They attribute three meanings to the word padrão. Monument as memorial, and possession was only underlined in the second dictionary published in 1789. So the second meaning is standard or model for measures and weights. And then third meaning, title of royal guaranteed interests, bond. This set of meanings, this is curious, these all connections. This set of meanings, monument, model, and long-term guaranteed interests, reinforce the idea of special event, memory linked to claims of possession. The stone pillar crosses provide the necessary link missed by Stefan Greenblatt when he analyzed, as if unprecedented, the ritual of possession involving written record performed by Columbus when he arrived at the Caribbean islands. The case of Diogo Cão, already mentioned here, who erected two padrões in 1483 in Central West Africa and two other in 1486, the last one in Cape Cross, the territory of modern Namibia, constitutes that missing link. It did not define immediate possession, but laid the mark of arrival that would be followed, hopefully for the Portuguese, by later occupation. It supposed a void of territorial power or real occupation by natives, which justified the claim and the intention. Political realities of sedentary populations with firm control of territory, which occurred in parts of Central and South America, parts of Western and Eastern Africa, as well as Asia, made the location and survival of padrões hazardous. We know that pillars were also erected in different parts of the New World and Asia, but they were not preserved, with one exception, at Sunda Calapa, in the island of Java, where in 1522 the local ruler had signed a peace treaty with the Portuguese and allowed them to build a fort. Local powers might have recognized the political meaning of these objects, although the logic of destruction should have varied. The issue of why padrões were not systematically demolished in Africa and in what conditions did they arrive at the late 19th century. The only pillar with a cross on top is exactly the one left in Namibia. We can only hypothesize the way populations refused or appropriated the pillar stone crosses. I don't think there was a singular attitude. Written culture and local complex political entities in Asia might have reinforced rejection of the padrões as intrusion, but the same demolition was observed on the coasts of the New World. Regular presence of the Portuguese in the area, as it occurred on the western coast of Africa, might have protected the memorials. Treaties and alliances with local powers certainly contributed to preserve those monuments. The stone pillars carried with them a purpose of communication, but it is disputable whether natives were the main target. The Portuguese were certainly eager to fulfill their role as propagators of the gospel under papal license of expansion and recognition of its consequences. And the first papal bulls are from the mid-15th century, as early as that. So the Pope recognized, gave license for, of expansion and recognized its consequences, meaning appropriation of territory, which would include claims of sovereignty, reduction of local populations to Christianity, and submission to the Portuguese king, but also disposal of local resources, including slave trade. The stone pillars were part of general claims to European law and faith, which they intended to impose. They represented the future integration of discovered lands into Christianity and the establishment of overseas territories by the Portuguese king. They were acts of possession in the name of Christ, but also, in a more pretentious way, the consecration and new birth of the targeted region, a transmutation of chaos into cosmos. Nomination of bays, capes, and places along the coast, as well as the Christian names of forts, all included in regularly updated cartography, were part of this process of territorial identification and appropriation. In a more prosaic way, the pillars were also a sign left for other Europeans who would venture in those areas, indicating precedence and intention to return. The implementation of European claims before legitimate resistance from native populations implied political and military strength, but in many cases, symbolic claims were left at that level when resolve or strength were lacking. Spontaneous inscriptions carved in 1485 by the same Diogo Cão and other Portuguese navigators on stones at Yelala Falls in the Säule River show the diffusion of the message from the king, followed by individual signatures. This detail reveals the importance of personal memorials in which navigators claimed their contribution to risky voyages of exploration. The main issue here, from a long view perspective, is how symbolic claims of precedence were recycled by the Portuguese during the European scramble for Africa before and after the Berlin Conference in 1884-85. This explains the persistent interest by the Lisbon Geographic Society, created in 1875, to unearth those padrões that testified very early presence, to which the reply from the Northern European powers, in line with 16th century debates, was to put up front real occupation as the main criterion for recognizing colonial rights. In this debate, African natives were obviously excluded. The claim of European early presence was even used against African people whose legitimate rights to land were denied by the policies of the apartheid regime. It is important to consider here what happened to the Portuguese padrão of the Cape Cross. I'm going to skip because it was already mentioned, how it landed here. It does not seem that Portugal ever claimed the right to repossess the testimony of the voyages of exploration that had been so much praised during the 19th and 20th century, up to the colonial wars of 1961-74. It was South Africa that claimed the return of the padrão during its administration of Namibia, perhaps as an European symbol, while independent Namibia have shown interest in a similar claim, as we saw now, from 1990, for the opposite reasons, as a testimony of long colonial presence against the natives' interests and as part of their history. So I would talk now about other European objects. I'm going to skip forts, ships, churches, because churches are extremely important, reshaping mainly the urban environment. Stone houses in the western coast of Africa is another important item to reshape those relationships and impose a relation of dominion. But in some cases, like in Mexico or in the future Peru, the size of their own monuments, of their own temples and palaces imposed also an enlarged size of European palaces and convents. It's a very interesting interaction also because the urban grid was shared between these civilizations. I will concentrate now on statues. They are a curiously late introduction in the colonial scene, but the fact is that there were few statues of kings, noblemen, and religious figures in Europe before the 19th century, besides the burial places. This century witnessed the extraordinary diffusion of statues of public figures, mainly kings or politicians, but also increasingly men of letters, scientists, and artists, seen as embodying the triumphant notion of nation. Names of streets in the colonial world celebrated, in many cases, European explorers, but the translation of this pattern into statues placed on central squares or harbors represented a much more expressive political communication. Dozens of statues of Queen Victoria, for instance, were placed all over the British Empire from the 1870s to the early decades of the 20th century. The image of the Queen on the throne was favored in Hong Kong. Mario Raggi, who created a significant number of public statues, was responsible for this bronze statue following the model defined by Albert Gilbert in 1887 for Winchester Castle. This model, politically charged, was also favored in India. The statue built in 1901 in Calcutta by George Frampton became the reference to the imposing memorial projected by William Emerson in 1905. Similar efforts to root the image of rulers among the natives were made by other colonial powers, but in some cases, particularly with the Portuguese, the reference to the past was overwhelming. It was not the present, it was the past. Most of the statues projected the image of historical figures such as Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama, or Afonso de Albuquerque, maritime and terrestrial explorers, and maritime and military men engaged in conquest and occupation at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Native cultures and leaders were obviously excluded. The most absurd case occurred in 1940 with the erection of the statue of Afonso Henriques, the first king of Portugal, in Luanda by public subscription. Again, it followed similar statues created in Portugal in 19th and early 20th century, which would underline the enormous sword placed in his tomb at Santa Cruz de Coimbra. We will see one of those statues. So the normal consequence of independence has been to rename streets and demount statues in order to erase the colonial past, except where there was a soft transition driven by the colonial elite in Australia, New Zealand, or Canada. In other countries, the statues of colonial rulers were placed in museums or existed probably due to the size of memorials such as the one in Calcutta. There are fantastic images, and you have several cases of images displaced, disappearing, or being vandalized, which is only natural. So there are fantastic images of statues dismantled. This is the statue of Salazar in Maputo, Mozambique, an exact replica in bronze of a similar statue created in 1937 by Francisco Franco, ironically placed on a narrow passage turned to the wall under a broken gutter. This process unintentionally enacts an idea coined by Nietzsche that we need to liberate ourselves from the past to build the future. We all know how the colonial past hangs on after independence, being exactly the subject of post-colonial literature, but legitimate political effort of breaking away from the colonial past has to be taken on board. So I move on to non-European objects. I will skip slaves and cowries, which have been very well studied, and ivories. So ivories were largely used as objects of exchange, both in Africa and Asia, reaching an important value due to its unique soft material, which is ideal for very sophisticated carving. In West Africa, skilled craftsmen adapted to the arrival of the Portuguese to produce ivory spoons and forks, olifants, hunting horns, salt cellars, and pyxids for the European market, which ended up in cabinets of curiosity. There was a considerable range of functions, from tableware to liturgical objects. The forms and many decorative elements were African, such as lizards, antelopes, snakes, fishes, or birds, mixed with images of European men, guns, and ships in the salt cellars. It is obvious that European images, surely prints, circulated and were assimilated, since many olifants recreated typical European scenes of hunting with deer, wild boars, or bears chased by dogs, while the images carved on pyxes represented well-known scenes of the life of Virgin Mary and Christ. The Estado de India created the environment for an extraordinary range of ivory work around Christian religious themes in the early modern period, with hundreds of pieces still on the market nowadays. So we have also, and I'm going to fast through this. We have also crosses and the reception of Christian crosses in Africa and their adaptation to local traditions of representation. Here we have a cross from Central West Africa. We have crucifixes and crosses, Nganji and Kuludzu, where we see the figure of Christ sometimes elongated or subject to the geometric decorative elements, while there are human figures sitting around, as we can see here, on the transversal arm of the cross, on top of under Christ, directly participating in his suffering, in a position of prayers or witnesses, sharing his message in an involved way, which contrasts with European reverence and ceremonial distance. In Asia, traditional furniture of very high quality concerning materials and artisanal work was adapted to the European taste, reproducing biblical scenes, European hunting settings, hybrid landscape visions. The advancements of Indian filigree in jewelry transferred to Europe by well-known artists in the early 16th century, like Raoul Chantin, was also adapted to create sumptuous caskets of gold and enamel. Mother of pearl and tortoise shell were also materials frequently used in caskets in Goa and different parts of South Asia, particularly the Gujarat. Mughal cabinets, generally made out of teak or ebony, supporting the inlaid of ivory, adapted their language to integrate European mythology, but also the representation of South Asians and Europeans. In Sri Lanka, the tradition of ivory caskets was used for political purposes. In this magnificent piece created circa 1543, now in Munich's Schatzkammer residence, the Portuguese King John III is representing crowning the Prince Dharmapala, grandson of Bhuvaneka Bahu, King of Kotte, who ruled between 1521 and 1551, who sought this sponsorship to guarantee succession of his lineage. Local artistic ability is shown in other ivory caskets, but I will move on to Japan, where you have this extraordinary art of lacquer adapted to create delicate oratories, in this case black lacquered wood with fittings in gilt copper, gold, silver and copper dust decoration on red lacquer markings and encrusted with mother of pearl. The unsurpassable skills of Japanese artists are also visible in Namban screens representing Portuguese traders in the Momoyama period. And finally, the famous Chinese porcelains introduced in the Council of Trent by the Portuguese and extensively traded by the Dutch in the 17th and 18th century were also customized to European taste, including symbols and coat of arms of religious orders and noble families, but also episodes from the Bible. These objects and these techniques inspired and influenced European culture. We know how filigree became diffused in jewelry, how porcelain was pursued through imitations in Europe until the secret of the material involved was finally discovered, while the production of silk, which had been admired since classical antiquity, had been introduced in Europe through the Islamic world during the Middle Ages. In conclusion of this section, there was wide exchange and appropriation of forms and techniques of arts and crafts between continents, valorization of new materials, practical use of cowries as money in Africa and Asia, traded by Europeans and quoted at the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. The way many objects were collected in the 16th century reveal a passion for the exotic as alien, strikingly different and attractively unusual, although detached from its original use, significance, and cultural framework, as Peter Mason rightly remarked. If classification of exotic objects developed in the early modern period, there was a parallel classification of human beings which reached the extraordinary encyclopedia compiled by James Coles Pritchard between 1828 and 1847, although his criticism of narrow racial frontiers was not taken on board by developers of this genre. The idea of objectification of human beings submitted to slave trade is unsettling, since they became the paradigm of racist prejudices and discriminatory actions that lasted until the 19th century and then beyond emancipation until nowadays. And my last point concerns museums. The cabinets of curiosity organized in the 16th and 17th century collected not only these objects we have been describing, but also minerals, plants, and embalmed animals. They were part of a setting that included botanic gardens and zoos with living plants and animals from different continents. Cabinets of curiosity were rightly defined by Giuseppe Olmi as places in which the prince could reassemble all reality in miniature, symbolically reclaiming dominion over the entire natural and artificial world. James Clifford brought new perspectives for this analysis. I quote, "In the West, collecting has long been a strategy for the deployment of a possessive self, culture, and authenticity. Possessiveness certainly," end of quote, "possessiveness certainly fueled obsessive collecting and defined a crucial feature of European mentality before the vast world. But I would relate it to the universalism that defined Christian church and empire since the Roman times. It is both the encyclopedic ambition of the Renaissance and the universalism of knowledge that fostered cabinets of curiosity, simultaneously justifying and feeding the interest for European expansion. It has to be said that Renaissance Neoplatonism favored the inclusion of art from different parts of the world related to the Western canon. Sylvie Desvacht studied the case of Francisco de Holanda, who lived between 1517 and 85, a Portuguese artist, friend of Michelangelo, and Victoria Colonna, who wrote crucial treatises on theory of art in which included the Hindu temples. Holanda was well placed to evaluate those examples since he was a friend of João de Castro, the humanist governor of the Portuguese Estado da Índia, who brought his Indian collection to Sintra in Portugal and recreated in his property a small Hindu temple. The openness of other Renaissance artists, such as Albrecht Dürer, who wrote that the objects he saw in Brussels, sent to Charles V by Cortés from Mexico, were among the most beautiful he had seen in his life, so this indicates the same capacity to appreciate and integrate other objects of art in a universal vision of archetypical forms. The transition from cabinets of curiosity and main collections gathered by noblemen and royal families to museums carried with it specialization and classification. Tribal art was clearly placed below the art from axial civilizations, while the European art was placed at the top. Spaces for exhibition were clearly differentiated. In the late 18th and 19th century, museums had the major purpose of promoting national culture and social inclusion under the same values and references to the past. Universalism was subsumed by nationalism, reinforced by imperial ambitions and capacities, well represented by the British Museum. In the meantime, colonial exhibitions with reconstitution of villages, temples, and presentation of peoples from other continents in their supposed habitat or recreated habitat were developed from the 1870s to the 1940s. They were projected as living museums, but they have been rightly analyzed as human zoos, undermining and placing other people from other continents in nature. Specific ethnographic collections created in general their own space, as the Peabody Museum affiliated with Harvard University or the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. The obsessive search for new ethnographic objects, including pieces collected from cemeteries, led to outrageous plunder of local communities, as in the French expedition to Africa in 1931-33, from Dakar to Djibouti, extensively reported by the surrealist Michel Deléry. And this was an expedition subventioned by the Musée de l'Homme. In the 1960s and 1970s, museums became criticized as elitist institutions, which excluded the vast majority of the population and were used to reaffirm the vision of the dominant class. L'amour de l'art by Pierre Bourdieu and Alain Darbel is a very good example of this trend. The independence of the colonies and the new drive of previously subordinated countries, even in Europe, see the case of Greece, raised the issue of repatriation of pieces looted during colonialism and imperialism. It looked like the museums had their decline guaranteed. But the opposite movement occurred. In the 1980s, the issue of multiculturalism was at the forefront of the ethnographic museums meetings. The way collections were displayed changed dramatically, with the input of new researchers, many of them from minorities, and consultation to the descendants of the communities from which the collections had been sourced. The museums, therefore, became a contact zone, friendly and engaging. Between 1989 and 2001, new museums were created in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, which reassessed the relations between settlers and indigenous populations. The same occurred in many other institutions, particularly in Asia and South America. I recall here the significant case of the Museum Emílio Gueldi, created in 1866 in Belém do Pará, Brazil, in the Amazon region, which established in the past 40 years an extraordinary program of devolution of pieces to indigenous populations who became regularly involved in their initiatives and in temporary exhibitions. In early 2000s, Arjun Appadurai and Carol Breckenridge acknowledged Tony Bennett's well-known concept of exhibitionary complex, which linked exhibition, discipline, social discipline, and state power in a setting complementary to Foucault's institutions of confinement, or the concept of institutions of confinement. But Appadurai and Breckenridge insisted that museums in India were enjoying a fresh post-colonial revival. The inclusion of different social strata occurred all over the world, as well as new relations with minorities and source communities. Ethnographic museums, but also museums in general, started to invite artists in residence who could relate to the existing collections and reflect on the artistic past of their communities. A new concept of museum emerged as a site of conscience, symbolized, for instance, by the Jewish Museum and the Holocaust Memorial created in Berlin. The Research Center for Material Culture, created in the Netherlands between the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, the Volkenkunde Museum in Leiden, and the Africa Museum in Berg en Dal, is an excellent example of the new work done with ethnographic collections. And the work by Wayne Modest is remarkable there. The concept of museums as open and inclusive social spaces made its way, being now reflected in the latest major project of the Humboldt Forum here in Berlin. In the meantime, the number of visitors exploded, fueled by the development of cultural tourism, since now we have more than 1.2 billion annual international arrivals around the world. The extraordinary increase of museums is revealing of the new possibilities that opened up. From 23,000 museums in the world in 1990, we have now more than 55,000. There are now 3,500 museums in China alone, where 451 new museums opened in 2012. I collected this data from the book by Nicholas Thomas, The Return of Curiosities, What Museums Are Good for the 21st Century. It has been a long way from the European cabinets of curiosity to the present museums, from indifferentiated collection of natural and man-made objects from all around the world to specialized, well-researched collections that are analyzed by consulting source communities. The structure and logic of museums changed from closed walls showcasing European supremacy to open spaces and contact zones facilitated by significant architectural innovation in which hierarchy has been replaced by horizontal interaction. Temporary exhibitions with borrowed pieces, many times from private collections or collections from local communities, are complemented by artists in residence and centers of research involving active members of minorities. To conclude, the disruption of European universalist model of collecting and classifying the culture of the world defines the last 50 years, which have seen a reinvigorated movement of renovation in museums and creation of dozens of thousands new museums all around the world. This movement defied the original purposes of museums and condemned the gloomy vision of inevitable decline that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, even if there is still a baggage of nationalist and colonialist past in Western museums. The properties of the pieces should be underlined here, again under the light of Albrecht Dürer, whose example calls attention to the way pieces of art, or arts and crafts, can stand for themselves, appealing in different ways to different publics, acquiring new meanings according to the historical context, or being used as regenerators of memories and identities from source communities. Thank you.